Thanks everybody for joining us today. So we're going to talk about what we define as a supplemental pre-design investigation. The reason it's called a supplemental pre-design investigation is because in 2020, we had done an initial investigation, and this investigation, as we'll talk through in the presentation, is to close any remaining data gaps and collect some additional data we didn't collect in 2020. So what we're going to cover today is just a quick overview of the project. These are slides you'll probably have seen before as we get through them. Then we're going to go through why are we sampling, what are we sampling, how are we sampling, and what's the timeline. And at various points throughout this, as Jessica pointed out, we'll have question periods. So this slide's a slide we've used a lot before. This is a reminder for everybody from the 2017 Record of Decision. This is what the Record of Decision defined for the Willamette Cove project area, which is the area defined in the red boundaries over here as the potential or the likely technology assignments for the project area. So the green is areas where EPA had in 2017 assumed it would be likely capping areas, and the yellow, which is essentially the riverbank and the shallow shoreline regions, had assumed that it would be likely dredging areas. And then just due to the way some of the things model, this is clear here. I don't think the intent was necessarily there wouldn't necessarily be something that happens through this gap here, but it's just the way the software models things. And then one other point to mention is our project area, as we'll talk through on this, is for roughly 46 acres, and 6 acres of its riverbank, but that riverbank is only encompassing the Willamette Cove upland facility riverbank along here. It does exclude the Crawford Street area of riverbank, which is incorporated with the upland parties cleanup actions. So this slide, again, is one that we've used quite a bit in the past. This is just a quick reminder of what happens during the remedial design process. Basically, there's a bunch of feedbacks that feed into remedial design, one of them being community input, which is we're here today to do that. One of them being process review, which, as we'll talk to later, the document goes to EPA, it gets reviewed by EPA and their partners to provide comments. One of them is data collection, which is what the supplemental pre-design investigation is data collection. So all these factors feed into remedial design. And then just to give everybody an overview where we're at in this overall design process, we began this process at the beginning of 2020. In 2020, we did our work plan for pre-design investigation. We implemented the pre-design investigation, and then we wrote a report for that. We're kind of in the same repetitive process that we had for the pre-design investigation for the supplemental pre-design investigation to collect the remaining data we have to collect. Theoretically, we should be able to collect all the data we need during this investigation. There's always during design, maybe something small may come up that we have to go back and do some very focused investigation. But the goal would be to try to capture every bit of information we still need during the supplemental, so that this is hopefully our last time frame we have to go out and collect actual data in the field. So we are working on the supplemental pre-design investigation right now. As you can see, this probably realistically should slide a little bit longer. We're anticipating having the document to EPA either late February, early March, probably realistically early March. They'll comment on it. That'll be the draft document. And then we will incorporate those comments, EPA and the partners and whoever other comments that they take into account. And then we will produce a final document, which will allow us to get into the field. At the same time, because we don't have enough going on, we submitted a draft basis of design report in December. We're waiting on comments back from EPA and their partners on the basis of design report, which we talked about in a previous presentation. And we are also working on the remedial design work plan, which is kind of a document that lays out the sequencing and a recognition of what we need to do to complete the design process, which gets us into 30, 60, 95, and 100% design. Going back to the top half, this work plan we're working on, we'll be implementing the work in the summer and fall, and then we'll write a report for that on the back end. And we'll have a slide later on that talks to a more detailed focus on the supplemental process. So why are we sampling? That's obviously the most important question. Why do we need to go out there and still sample? One of the reasons why we're sampling is to fill data gaps. So when we did the investigation in 2020, we collected a number of data points, and with those data points, it always answers a lot of questions, but it may create some additional questions that we need to refine the answers to those questions. So that is one of the reasons we're going out there. In addition, Riverbank sampling was not performed in 2020. All the Riverbank sampling will be performed in 2022. So we have a data gap with the Riverbank data. There's some historic sampling, but as a group, the Willamette Cove and Water Party has not performed any Riverbank sampling. And then we need to delineate the extensive contamination. Obviously, the data we collected in 2020 gave us a lot of clarity on that. What we found when we ran the models on that data, there's still a few points at the edges, still a couple data gap points that we need to close. So we have to collect some additional data to fully refine that extent of where our cleanup areas will be. And then, some information that's needed to support remedial design through development of the basis of design report and just planning for the design process. We recognize that there's some field data that we could collect that would help support the remedial design process. So, what are we sampling? We're sampling, similar media as before, but also a little bit more expansive, multiple media, which, media being soil, sediment, water. Soil will be the riverbank soil. The sediment will be shallow and deeper sediment where we still need to sample. And then the water will be pore water and groundwater interaction with the pore water, not so much necessarily sampling the groundwater itself in the uplands, but sampling the pore water and trying to understand how the pore water and groundwater interact. And then, how are we sampling? So there's pretty standard practices out there that have been developed over a lot of years on how you sample. And so we're using these best practices and these standard approaches that are written in various plans that EPA and other agencies have developed for collecting samples. And then, in accordance with our requirements, we have the record decision that lays out requirements. EPA has developed this remedial design guidance document that lays out requirements. And then there's also a riverbank guidance that had been developed, all three, the ROD, the remedial design guidance, and the riverbank guidance specifically for Portland Harbor. So all these things go into how we consider the sampling and our approaches to sampling. And just to give you kind of an overview of where this project's been over time, I actually just had our JS person run this because I was curious without having to count every single one of these. This shows kind of all the sampling that's been done since the beginning of the Portland Harbor project. Different symbols are, different time periods that aren't shown on here. Excuse me. This one, excuse me, just the 2020. And then we, in addition to what was collected previously, we have sampled a bunch of locations in 2020. So it is pretty extensive, the data we collected in 2020. All these different points are locations where we had data collected. We had a lot of surface and subsurface sediment sampling that was collected. Subsurface just meaning below that top foot of sediment. And then we have sediment traps we place. Sediment traps are meant to collect floating sediment that gets captured inside of a tube, and then we collect that. And then pore water, which is the water in the matrix in between the sediment. So that's all these locations are areas where one of these forms of sampling was conducted. And then, what are we sampling? Again, getting back to this kind of intro slide. So we created this visual to try to help everybody visualize what we mean by sampling these different areas. So what we are sampling is surface sediment, again, surface sediment being the top foot of sediment in the river system. And then we have subsurface sediment. So anything below the top foot of sediment, we would sample that would be called the subsurface. We have the pore water. So again, the pore water is the material, the water in between the solid matrix of the sediment. So we would be sampling that material. And then, groundwater movement. So the groundwater is this water that's in this layers, whether it's fill layers or native layers, that move towards the river and eventually come up as the pore water. So we're trying to understand this interaction between groundwater and pore water. And then the riverbank. The riverbanks in erodible areas have a potential to have sediment come down the riverbank and end up as sediment in the river system. So we'll be sampling this riverbank soil. This doesn't give a perspective of areas where it's more flat. You've got a few beach areas in Willamette Cove, and Doug, I'll get to you in a second. A few areas where kind of have these beach zones that are flatter. So while this shows kind of a steeper grade, we recognize that the change in this slope and along a riverbank varies. And Doug, what questions can I answer? You're still on mute.
Do you have any idea how deep it is to bedrock from, say, the beach?
Great question. Yeah, one of the things we're going to actually do some investigation on as part of this investigation. You'll see this in a later slide. In general, the depths we're sampling, 10 to 12 feet. We didn't encounter bedrock except for within one area of the site on that western half, closer to the boundary with the Crawford Street area. In that area, we encountered shallow bedrock. And so part of what we're going to be doing in this investigation is trying to figure out exactly the extent of that shallow bedrock.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cassie's interested in knowing when the community will be able to see the plans and reports.
Yeah, so we're developing these documents right now. We'll have these documents developed late this month at best. Early next month is probably more likely. So early March, we'll be sending them to EPA. And my understanding is EPA will be willing to distribute those documents to the public. And that's the plan at this point, is that when we pass those to EPA, that they can pass those along, or we can provide a link if needed.
I can just jump in on that too, since I'm here from EPA. So yeah, we heard this request yesterday. And so I just want to kind of clarify a couple of things, because it is not typical for us to distribute for, a comment or early a document like this for a sampling plan and approach for community feedback at this point. But for many of you I know on this call are also on the Cathedral Park Project Area Working Group that EPA is leading right now, since we're right now in charge of that work. And so we, for that site, did have Marcus Griswold, who's the technical advisor, which is an independent technical assistance provider that the Willamette River Advocacy Group directs, provided comments on that draft sampling plan. And so because Cathedral Park is such a high area of community interest, as we know, and it's near and dear, that was done at that site. And Marcus did provide comments at the same time that we had a different group that we have provide comments on draft documents, because we're under a memorandum of understanding to do so, provide comments too. And so for Willamette Cove, I've talked to our technical team, and because we know obviously this is also a high area of community interest, when the city, the port, and the state do provide EPA with this plan, as Josh said, which is anticipated, it sounds like in early March. At that time, we have received a request from the Willamette River Advocacy Group, I know just today, for them to take a look, to have Marcus take a look, their technical advisor, at that document and provide comments to EPA, that we would support that for this case. And I do just want to say, because it's not always typical for us to do that, but we know that there's, this is an important site, and it would make a lot of sense. I just want to acknowledge, though, that not every agency has the same support that we do to have a draft document like that put out for public comments, and for Marcus, the technical advisor, to provide feedback, because it does take effort to respond to those comments and then circle back. So I just want to clarify that. So.
Thank you, Laura. Cassie, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, this, I think, because the cove is in the river and on the land, it's sort of like we like to see a similar process for the upland area. So talking, if we can have that follow-up conversation with all those parties, including DEQ, Port Metro, contractor, about the feasibility of doing it a similar way, so that the community groups and can weigh in the same way, that would be ideal.
Yeah,
Thanks, Cassie.
this is Dwight Leisel, Portland. I can address that process for the upland documents. We're going to follow a similar process. So, you know, I think it's safe to say that we all want to see the site cleaned up as soon as possible, but we want to do it in a way that that meets community values. And so, to ensure that happens, we're going to continue to submit our documents to the required regulatory agency per our requirements or legal obligations. But as far as the upland sampling plan that we're developing, we will provide that to the community as you requested, but it'll occur after we submit it to DEQ. And I think I'll be talking more about that as we get into my overview of what where we're at on the upland. So I hope that answers your question, Cassie.
Yeah, I think that's great. And the, you know, kind of the next follow-up question is like, will DEQ, you know, be willing to take feedback from the community and from the technical advisor and integrate it?
Yeah, I can speak for the port. We'll work with DEQ if we receive community comments. We'll work with DEQ and Metro, our partner, on the upland, and you know, figure out a way to best address those comments. Thank you.
Erin, is there anything? I know we need to speak with your manager.
Yeah. Well, and I was just going to say too, Cassie, I was wondering if we could pause on the upland conversation until we get through this part, because we actually do have time allocated on the agenda to provide an update on that.
Okay.
All right, so Doug's question was at the perfect time because that was actually the next slide was a pause slide for questions. So is there any other questions about the overall investigation objectives before we get into, you know, specific investigation approaches? All right, we'll move on. And if we got any other questions, we'll have more pause points as we go along. So type of sampling we're doing, how we're sampling. So surface sediment sampling. During the previous investigation, we had used power grab sampling to collect surface sediment samples. We have some additional surface sediment samples we're going to have to collect again. What a power grab is basically a mechanical bucket with hydraulic pistons on it. And as you can see from this picture on the left, it goes down with the bucket open. It's very similar to almost like a dredge bucket. And it sets on the sediment surface. It closes around that sediment. And then it comes back up with sediment inside the bucket, as you can see from the picture on the right. You decant the water off the top of that, that's what you're seeing with his hand. He's got a tube in there. He's taking the water off the top. And then once you get that river water off the top of it, then you sample that sediment. And you try to sample it such that you don't touch sidewalls. You want to get sampled that may not be in contact with the sides of it. And you try to sample it through the entire depth of it. So that's how you collect the surface sediment sample. And this scoop has to at least come back with 20 centimeters of sediment, which would suggest that you at least got the top 20 centimeters, with the goal trying to get to the top 30 centimeters of sediment. So you're really, and why they do the top foot in a centimeter, 30 centimeters is roughly equivalent to a foot, but this is the way all the documents are written. I'm not the one who designed it that way, but just in case people are wondering why 20 or 30 centimeters. So basically 8 inches or a foot, 20 centimeters would be 8 inches and 30 would be a foot. So we're trying to get that top foot of material. And we will with this, you take it from 3 points, you grab that sample and you composite together in a single sample. So it's more representative of the surface, not just a single point location. So the next slide shows subsurface sampling. We did a little bit of this during the previous investigation. We started out with vibrocoring, which vibrocoring is historically the preferred approach, but it only works really well in soft sediment because we had very mixed sediment. We had some softer material and we had some material that had a lot of sands and gravels in it. Vibrocoring doesn't have a lot of power behind it, so it works really poorly when you got a lot of resistance to the tube going down into the water. So we did on the back end, to answer some questions we had, we did some sonic drilling, and we found the sonic was highly successful. So we're going to go ahead and do sonic drilling as the preferred approach for the subsurface collection. This is the intervals below a foot for collecting the data. And this is done, this is a drill rig core barrel. It's hollow in the middle of this core barrel. And then the sediment goes up into this core barrel, and then you attach a tube to the end of this, a bag to the end of this, as you can see from this plastic bag, and then it slides out of the tube barrel, and you have this long segment of soil, or sediment, I should say, here. And we're sampling this, and we know the lengths of it and the depth zones that it is based on where it comes out. And you use this tape measure to help align it. Yeah, Doug.
I haven't heard the term sonic related to pushing the core samples down into the settlement before. Could you describe a little bit how sound affects sampling?
Yeah, so basically it's a tube, a very high frequency vibration, very, very minimal. You really wouldn't even necessarily notice it, but these high frequency vibrations help vibrate it down into the sediment. So, rather than like a vibrocore tube is just a tube, and the moment you get resistance, it stops. This uses very fine micro vibrations to help move it past those sand particles, because the sand particles will just move just slightly enough so that it'll either go in or out of the barrel, and it allows you to continue down. So sonic drilling, the cost had come down a lot. Back when the technology was first around, it was super expensive to do. And as like any technology, it gets more widely used, and they figure out how to do it at lower cost, the technology price comes down. So most drilling that's done these days, they moved away from geoprobe, which they call, it's a rod where it uses hydraulic pressure at the top, very kind of similar to how vibrocore works in water. And they moved to this sonic drilling because the cost have come down so much, and you get a lot better recovery, and you have a lot less problems with resistance to the rod trying to move through the soil or sediment.
Thank you. That's interesting.
So next slide, one of the things we're looking at doing, and I apologize that the image on the right is a little bit blurry. We had to pull this off of online, but hopefully it gives you some perspective as we'll talk through it. This is called sediment profile image. The short of it is, it's essentially, if you look at this picture on the left, it's a camera that's put on a vertical plate, and it's got this angled, a triangular type of piece behind it. So rather than this being squared out on the backside, it's a triangular shape outward. And so you take this whole platform, you set it down on the sediment surface, and then you use hydraulic pressure to push that camera plate down into the top 20 or 30 centimeters of sediment. And then what it does is it takes a picture. And so this picture on the right, and again, I apologize, it's a little bit blurry, but it is basically taking the picture. And actually the real picture you'll get at a site, since this came offline, it had to be reduced in file size for them to post it on a website, but you're going to get a very high resolution picture. And what this is going to tell you is a couple things. This picture is using as an example of when they place the cap, so they could take the picture to figure out how well the sand cap set in place and how much mixing happened where it happened. But in the same way, you could take a look at the different layers of sedimentation that occurred over time in the surface and see if there's a lot of mixing of your sediment surface, which is one of the things we're going to look at for now, or whether you're getting these real nice defined settling layers that as different sediment comes down, they're going to potentially have different coloration over time, depending on time of year, depending on how old it is, depending on other factors, and see those sedimentation layers. That's one thing we're looking for. And then even more importantly, we're looking for what they call benthic invertebrate activity, which is the macroorganisms that live in the shallow zones of the sediment. We're trying to understand also how deep that those benthic organisms burrow into the sediment surface. It's a really important factor to understand and verify for our site, because we do need to use that input into our capping modeling systems to determine the depth that we have to make sure that the sediment surface is clean out, because these benthic organisms, we don't want them to burrow into contaminated sediment for the rest of the time. So it helps define our capping thicknesses. So it's important for both those reasons. It helps understand depositional patterns, and it helps us understand the depth of burrowing microorganisms or macroorganisms, excuse me. So the next slide is, we're going to run a variety of field and laboratory tests on the sediment. So the top left is showing what they call a dredge elutriate test. What the point of this test is you got a different columns. You're taking some sediment from the site, you're mixing it with water, you're stirring it up, you're trying to get it all displaced, just like when you're dredging around the bucket. You're not going to obviously disturb massive amounts of sediment, but anytime a dredge bucket takes a scoop in the water, pulls it up, you're going to have some stuff sitting on the outside, some sediment sitting on the outside. You're going to have a little bit of plume that'll come up off of it. So we're trying to simulate this thing. And when a dredge bucket would come up and that little bit of sediment that gets disturbed around the dredge bucket scoop. And so you're taking some sediment, you're mixing with water, you're stirring it, you're seeing how quickly it settles out. And then you're taking that water off the top and you're collecting that water and you're running a laboratory test on that to determine the chemical concentrations on that. Because that's really important for us to understand how concerned do we need to be about this sediment that gets disturbed up while you're dredging, and what type of measures we need to take to limit the mobility of that, as well as the potential concerns related to the contaminant concentrations that could be associated with that. So that's the point of the picture on the left. The top right is showing we take some sediment out of the river, we mix it. This is one example of a way to mix it. You know, this is a little mason concrete tub that you mix in. You're trying to stir the sediment with the water in there so it's not separated. And then you can run a couple different tests. So you can take that material, you can put it into what's called a slump cone. This is the same cones that you use if anybody's ever familiar with concrete work. And you put it in there and you pull that cone up after you put it in there and see how much that sediment settles out. That tells you how stackable that material is. You're going to take that material and you're going to set it on land to try to stockpile it in an area. Is that just going to spread out to the volume that's available, or is that sediment going to actually stay stacked? And it helps determine how much space you need to manage that material. In the same way, whether it's going to go onto a material barge, you know, how much will that material stack, or how much will it spread into the volume available? Another thing you can do with it is you can add things to it, like concrete, cement to it. You can add concrete lime dust. You can add other types of agents to it. They make polymerizing agents that help dewater the sediment and help solidify the sediment. So that's what this is showing on the bottom right, is you're taking this, you're adding some admixtures to the sediment to try to take it from this soupy state into a state that's stronger. And the reason for that is a couple reasons. One of it is landfills typically have requirements when you take it to a landfill to have that material be able to have a certain degree of strength, so they don't dump it in the landfill from the truck and it's spreading all over the landfill, that it actually stays stacked together, kind of like what we're trying to learn with this in its current state. And you'll run the same slump test with it after you add materials. But also we're trying to see how much it hardens over time. So these type of cylinders, basically, they're just hollow cylinders that you add this material into, and then you can put in these molds and send it to a lab to tell you how strong that material is, how much force it takes to resist it, and also how well it stays together if you tried to take it out of there. So there's a number of things we're going to run to try to understand how we would handle that sediment once it's removed out of the river to ultimately go to a landfill. So questions on the sediment sampling goals and processes?
There aren't any in the box. Jim does have his hand up though.
Sure.
And not so much a question, but Josh, can you just highlight for folks that when you went through all those protocols, the lab sampling protocols, lab protocols, whether it's looking at grain size analyses or the slump test, those are all standard established tests, so that you can use that data and compare it with published data and other, you know, existing information. So we're not recreating the wheel here. We're using established science.
That's correct. For example, like the slump test, that is used universally for concrete testing. So it's the exact same protocol. We're just using it on soil. Some of these other tests, like Jim said, you're putting them in cylinder the same way you would do it with concrete cylinders. You put a third of the material in, you tamp it down, you add a third more, you tamp it down, add a third, and then you leave it for a certain period of time. You send it to the lab, they run it in a machine, they run it. These are all standardized tests. And in addition to Jim's point, we are developing not just the field sampling document, which is one of the documents we develop a plan called a quality assurance project plan that talks to the laboratory approaches. All these plans, EPA and their partners will review, and if they have comments on it, they'll feed those comments back to us, and we'll make changes to our plan based on these comments. But Jim's absolutely right. These are based on standard practices and being able to compare them to the standard protocols. Yeah, Doug. You're on mute again. Doug, you were on mute. I wasn't able to hear you.
I always forget.
That's okay. I do too.
Are you doing any sampling through or under the McCormick and Baxter cap that's on the north side of the railroad trestle?
No,
That
thanks.
covers a
Great
big
question
part of the
there.
code.
McCormick and Baxter has their own sampling program they're required to do as part of their annual or their 5-year review process. And that sampling, to your question, actually was conducted last year. That was the 5-year review point sampling. So they're doing sampling. And in addition to that, I know they do a less extensive annual type of sampling program there. But that is outside of our project area. So we're not sampling McCormick and Baxter cap or around it or under it. We're
Okay,
sampling up to it, with our project area, but not necessarily on the other project. Any other questions? All right, moving on to kind of the next area is Riverbank. So I thought this slide was actually a really good example of the different type of things we have to think about with the riverbank. This is one spot along the Willamette Cove Riverbank specifically. This is close to anybody that might be familiar with the area. As you get out of that major beach in the inner cove and start working toward the west side, and you get kind of that smaller riprap along that west shoreline of the inner cove as it goes towards the downriver side of the main channel. That's kind of that transition point here. So, the sites it's not uncommon across our site at the top of the riverbank, which is kind of the transition point of between the upland property and ours. This is probably a good example where there's grasses at the top strip of where that transition, this would be upland behind that, and this would be part of our work on the riverbank below that point. But, along this riverbank in a number of spots, there's these large trees and root systems at the top of bank. These root systems and trees have a potential, not only do we have to evaluate and understand how they may impact the stability and how much erosion would be going on in the bank, but also understand how it could impact the design in the future by having these there. So we have to think about that. We have to look at how erosion's occurring around these tree root systems. We have to look at large debris, and we're going to do some surveying to identify any of this larger debris that sits along the riverbank and in the low shoreline, including inventorying all the piles, because every one of these piles we're anticipating are going to have to get removed. And so we want to have an inventory of any of this large debris, any piles, any other things that are within our project area we have to consider. We have to look at areas away from trees, erosional areas. So this was a good example of a spot where there's some erosion going on along the bank, and we need to be able to take a look at that. We need to evaluate that. Another things we look at is riprap and rock armoring. Is there armoring on the bank? Is it sufficient? Is it protective to keep the bank from eroding? These are other things we have to look at. And then, the point about the beach area, we have to sample the beach area kind of differently than we sample the slope areas, because obviously the beach areas are much more potentially user-friendly to human habitat versus going up and down the bank. Humans may be accessing it, but you're probably not going to hang out on that slope a long period of time, whereas somebody could potentially spend more time on a beach area. So we want to sample these slightly differently than we sampled the riverbanks itself.
Hey, Josh, it looks like Bob Salinger's got a question
Yeah,
for
Bob?
you.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious how, the habitat value figures into this work. I mean, because those tree roots and that unstable bank is salmon habitat. So I'm just curious how that factors into what you do and what you're looking at.
Yeah, no, great point, Bob. So that's obviously something we've got to look at. But by suggesting and highlighting this, we're not saying that these will have to necessarily be removed. It's just a factor we have to look at, and we have to evaluate how it's impacting the riverbank and whether it's beneficial or not beneficial. And is there contaminated sediment around these tree roots and that aspect. So by highlighting it, I wasn't trying to give any qualifier one way or another, whether it's positive or negative, just a point about it being there.
No, and I appreciate it. I didn't think you were, but one of our big concerns is that in the name of removing contaminants, we wind up removing what little habitat is left in the North Reach, and we wind up with a lot of hardened, steepened, rip-wrapped banks, and how we sort of avoid that. And whether, when you look at this, whether we're looking at it to see whether it needs to be removed or covered, or whether it needs to be if it's contaminated, potentially removed and restored, and how you get from, how do you not lose ground as we do this, I guess is where I'm trying to get to.
I think that's a real legitimate point, and I think it's a difficult question. And we have 2 years of design we have to go through, and that's going to be one of the things we really have to weigh. There's all sorts of weighting factors, and I think we've talked about this in previous presentations. But for better or worse, this isn't a simple process. There's a lot of weighting factors that go into it. Yeah, Jim.
Well, I just wanted to add to your response to Bob that there'll be a requirement that no fisheries will be involved in the final remedy determination, and that there will be mitigation requirements based on the type of remedy that's selected. So all of those considerations will come into play definitely before remedy takes place.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Jim. That's a great point. So this next slide talks to kind of our approach we're looking at for sampling the beach areas. So this has become kind of the more common sampling approach for areas to really understand, rather than getting a specific point. If you're trying to understand the exposure to either ecological or human receptors over an area like a beach, this incremental sampling methodology, as it's called, has become the most common way to do it. And this picture on the left is kind of showing there's 3 different ways to do it. The overall goal is to randomize, collect samples across an area. So let's say, from one end of a beach to another over the width of the beach, you want to systematically collect different random samples, and those samples feed into a common container, and then they're mixed both in the field and mixed in the laboratory to try to get a representative sample that represents the overall area. So there's 3 different approaches to randomization. There's a simple randomization where, let's say it's 30 points you're going to collect. You collect it, you let software run 30 randomized points, and it'll plot out 30 points for you. You can break the site into 30 grids. I think this is 30 grids. And you say, I'm going to take it in the left corner of each grid. And so you're covering everywhere, and you're doing 1 in each grid. And then you can have 30 grids, and you can do it randomly within those grids. You can let the computer run random points within those grids. So those are kind of the 3 common approaches. On the right, we're showing how we would collect these. There's kind of 2 ways to do it. You could either, there's a number of ways you could do it, I should say. Our probably most common ways we do it is either with a hand auger, where you turn that hand auger. It's just like an earth auger, but it has solid side pieces on it. You twist it in the ground, you pull out a plug of soil, you put it into a container, and then you mix it with all these other increments that you do, and it goes into a laboratory in a jar with all these different 30 points. The other way we do it, which we found to be a little faster, is we take a auger attachment. That's essentially one of these wide type of wood auger attachments. If you've ever seen those for drills, you can use a drill, and then you have something like a plate or a bowl with a hole drilled in the middle that, as the auger turns, it twists up the soil to the top, and it goes into that, and then you collect that material, and then you mix it together, and then you send it off to the lab. With the goal being that, like I said, you're collecting equal amounts of material from each one of these dots, and those are going in to create a representative sample that goes through a pretty sophisticated, thorough mixing process at the laboratory. Jim or Bob, I don't know if you still have questions or your hands are up from before.
No, sorry, I didn't take it down, but I'll take it down now.
Thanks. I would say next thing would be discrete sampling. What the difference between that is, the other one's like a very intensive composite sampling. Discrete sampling is just a fancy word for collecting a single sample from a point. So this was another site we did along the riverbank. So the river, as you can see from this picture, it can be really challenging because we have some of these similar type of challenges where you got rock, broken up concrete, riprap, soil that may be real compacted along the riverbank. So in order to collect these samples, you may use a stainless steel spoon, a garden trowel. They sell stainless steel garden trowels. And the reason you use stainless steel because they're a lot easier to decontaminate between locations. And you can dig it out. You can use a hand auger again, as the middle picture is showing, or what was used at this site that's could be used is these tubes that they use for vibrocoring. You can take that same tube, and this is just a roto hammer with a special attachment on the end, and it's using that vibrating pressure to help push it down into the soil and collect that sample, and then it comes back up in the tube. So these are just 3 examples of ways you can do it. There's endless different ways people go about it. You know, it all depends how deep you need to get and how many samples you need to collect, you know, help determine the speed of doing that and what's the right approach. Some of these locations, to be frank, with how steep our riverbank is, you may be limited to only the left option because you may be barely being able to scramble up that slope to grab that sample, and you may not be able to, you know, get the angle to do it with a hand auger, and you may not have the ability to do it with a tool like the last one. So, you know, these are all different approaches that are used in different situations, but the goal being collect a single point sample. For the top of the riverbank, an additional type of sampling that's used largely for geotechnical investigation, but you can collect soil samples from it too, is called mud rotary drilling. The reason it's called mud rotary drilling is as the cutter head on the drill goes down, it has this mud slurry that it pushes in there to help break up the surface and help you know, loosen that soil to pull up the material as you do it. And in the center, you've got this rod, which they call split spoon, where it literally is a split rod, and that's why they call it a split spoon. They're 18 inches long. They take that rod, they put it down in the center of this larger borehole that they create, and they use a hammer on the top of it to push it ahead of the drill cutting head, and they collect a soil sample from that. You can do it as often or as little as you want, and what you end up with is amount of material that fills in there, you know, theoretically 18 inches of material, that full spoon, and then you split that open and you can log that for geotechnical parameters, for grain size, for different soil types, or you can collect samples out of that if you need to. Largely, we're using the mud rotary drilling to fill some additional data gaps. We did this work before during the 2020 investigation in support of the geotechnical, you know, riverbank stability type of understanding, as well as seismic evaluation support for doing liquefaction evaluations. We have to understand the soil types to know whether in a large earthquake event that these riverbank materials would liquefy. Here's another one. This one actually is pretty neat, but it's probably hard to explain in a short presentation like this. They call this cone penetrometer testing. Rather than having a rod with an opening in the middle that soil comes up through, it's a solid rod that has a special sensor tip on the tip of it. You can either use a truck as shown in the top right kind of picture, or you can use, basically they're like geoprobe equipment. They're equipment that has a hydraulic push head on the top of it, and it drives it through. But the important part is this little head that goes on the very end of these solid steel rods. What you get with this is you get, as it moves down to the soil at a very slow rate or sediment, you get these different readings at different depths as you move through it. And these readings are fed into a computer at the ground surface. And then a geotechnical engineer takes a look at this data and determines whether the material is a certain type of material, the amount of pore water pressure in here, how much friction determines how hard or how loose that soil zone is. So this is really helpful for understanding both, you know, it can be used in upland environments, or it can be used, in our case, we're going to use it in the sediment to take some points around the site in the sediment areas to understand those properties of the sediment for purposes of placing a cap down the road or for dredging, to understand how stable that sediment is, and as we would dig it out or as we place a cap, how that sediment that's already there would respond to that. And one of the benefits of this type of method is you get information really quick. So it's a lot faster to move around and collect data points, and you get the data in real time, so you can see in real time and get that understanding, which may help inform, maybe you want to move around to another location or do some additional collection. You don't have to wait till it gets back to a laboratory. The laboratory runs it and you get that information back, or it goes into machine. It takes time later before you see those results. That's one of the real nice benefits of cone penetrometer testing. You get real-time data. One of the other things, to answer Doug's question from earlier, that we're trying to figure out where this depth of bedrock is in the below the sediment line, especially in this west half of the site, which is where we're going to focus this investigation, is called this electrical resistive tomography. It's just a fancy way of saying you're going to put a cable in the ground, you're going to pass a signal through that cable, it's going to put out energy out of that cable, and it's going to sense the feedback it gets from that. So basically the resistance, and why it's called a resistivity method. And so this cable drops on the sediment floor, it pushes out energy through the cable, pushes out electricity through the cable. It gives us pulsed emission out of it, and then it gets this readings back based on the resistance in the line. And so what it gets, and this may not be the easiest to really understand, and frankly, a geotechnical engineer probably is better at interpreting this. But you know, you see these different colors. So even someone who's not an expert in that can understand that these colors represent, you know, maybe more dense environments, and so there's denser zones where it's darker colors represents the depth, the likely depth to bedrock. So in this case, this black is showing kind of the line where, you know, the cable sits, and or it's showing depths of borings. I'm not exactly sure which. This came from a presentation from a conference, and you know, they're using this information. No, actually, I know this was depths of boreholes, the bottom of their boreholes. This is real data they had, and then the cable sits on this top surface. And then, you know, based on these different colors, you know, where the bedrock might be. So let's assume the bedrock is in this orange zone is probably what the results say. So that's the goal we're trying to do with this, is understanding where bedrock is and how deep it is. And then, you know, what all of us are very concerned with is, you know, the riverbank erosion. And not only, you know, is the riverbank eroding, but, you know, are there chemicals associated with that would be driving concern about this erosion? We're going to be looking for the answers to both. This part of it is doing the initial assessment to understand where along the riverbank it's eroding. So we're going to take a look at that whole riverbank adjacent to the Willamette Cove upland site, and we're going to walk that riverbank. We're going to take representative sections based on different characteristics of sections of the riverbank, and we're going to do one of these forms. These forms basically are the process that was defined by EPA they want to use for evaluating the riverbank. And it looks at the height of the riverbank. It looks at, you know, the root depth zone in that riverbank. Are the roots in there? The density of the roots in the riverbank, the angle of the bank, whether there's armoring surface protection on the riverbank. And then all these things go into a score sheet on the right side. And based on the results of these score, you basically get this kick out of, is the bank have a very low potential for eroding? Does it have a low potential, moderate, high, very high, or does it have extreme risk for eroding? And you know, obviously these high to extremely high are concerning to us, that we want to make sure we understand, you know, is this bank really eroding? And if it's eroding, what the chemical characteristics of the soil are where it's eroding. So it's a very standardized process that's used, and uses a score sheet and uses all these factors in there. So I thought this was worth showing how we really evaluate the erosion on the riverbank. We're not just walking the riverbank, taking a look and saying, we think this spot looks bad, this doesn't. It's got a whole process to this. So a couple, you know, questions, you know, pause points. What do you have, questions you have about the riverbank sampling and our kind of surveying goals and process? And what type of questions do you have about the geotechnical? I kind of put together both the riverbank and the geotechnical, as they're very interrelated.
We don't have any questions in the chat box yet.
Okay, thanks. All right, I'll go ahead and move on then. So the next thing is features surveying. So there's two aspects we talked about a little bit early on with the riverbank. Those features along the riverbank, we'll collect data on that. We'll, you know, write to the conditions of those features. And then in water, obviously in water, we can't see the features. So we got one of two options that we're planning to use to look at these features that are below the water line. The most, you know, common technology that was used historically and still is used quite a bit today is divers. But with the advance of drone technologies and advancement and some of this, you know, electronics that are getting smaller and smaller, we now have the capabilities and the resolution of cameras too to use what they call remote operated vehicle. This is a submersible. It kind of looks like a boombox from back in the days, but it's these are blades on it that, you know, move the vehicle around. It has a cable that goes to the surface. It has all these cameras, as you can see, kind of in the middle there, that looks out. And so you drop this down in the water. It's got these buoyancy pieces on the underside, and it floats around and it moves to where you want it to get pictures. And then it's got this little grapple on the front. If you needed to grab something or get yourself untangled from something, it does give you a little arm to try to help with that. But we'll probably be using a combination of both these. Both of them have benefits downsides. The benefits of the remote operated vehicle, obviously, is you're not putting somebody underwater in the health and safety risk anytime you're putting a diver in the water. But some things you just need to get a diver out there for, so we'll probably be looking at a combination. Some of the things we need to survey is there's a timber pile wall at one point. You can see kind of the top edge of it when the river's low. That wall, we're not totally sure was created, but I'm assuming, our thought is that it was created to kind of hold back the river from eroding in that portion of the river. It's in the central parcel in front of the Willamette Cove central parcel area. And then we've got, some underwater vessels that have sunk over time. We want to be able to understand the conditions of those vessels better. And there's some minor other things we'd like to take a look at too. Groundwater and pore water. So this is the other big piece that we need to evaluate. We really, we did some limited sampling of pore water in 2020. We were going to do a more expansive program in 2022. And in order to help really understand this groundwater pore water interaction, we know that the adjacent parcels have historically had impacted groundwater, and we want to understand if that impacted groundwater is, potentially impacting the sediment at our site, or if our sediment's purely just impacted from the history of sediment depositing into our site. So we have to do some additional investigation to help answer some of those questions. So one of the things that we've been doing since 2020, we're going to continue to do, is we have what they call a transducer, which is basically a water level monitor in a stilling well that's in the river encased within a PVC casing to measure the changes in height in the river level. And we have ones in 5 wells at the top of the bank, so we can see how the interaction between the water levels in those wells in the river stage is, and the effects on one another between the water levels in the soil at the top of the riverbank and the river level changes. So if the river level goes up, does water tend to move into the upland? If river level drops, does water tend to discharge out of the riverbank into the river? Or is there this constant movement of water from the riverbank into the river? Next thing we've got as part of this is a further evaluation of pore water. Pore water is that water in the space in the sediment. We really are continuing to evaluate that and try to really understand the impacts and whether there's a direct correlation between the concentrations in the sediment and the pore water in the matrix around that sediment, or if this may be driven by movement of impacted groundwater from adjacent sites into our project area. And then the kind of final piece that's associated with that is seepage rates. Okay, so we've asked the question, is there a relationship? What are the concentrations? Now we want to understand, what is the flux? With flux being how quickly does water move through the sediment and into the river, or vice versa. So these seepage meters are essentially this cylinder or this drum you put down over a spot in the sediment, and you sense that rate of movement.
Hey, Josh,
Yeah.
I want to just do a time check. So we've got 13 minutes for the rest of this conversation. And I know we've got a big question at the end where we're hoping to get folks' feedback. So I wanted to make sure we are able to get to that. And then I also just wanted to share with folks that Heather and I've been in communication with the other presenters or other folks around the agenda for this afternoon's meeting. And they have graciously agreed to provide updates at the next meeting that we have at the top of the agenda. So we do have the remaining time tonight for this discussion, but we definitely want to make sure we get to some of those other questions at the end too, Josh.
Okay.
So I just wanted to flag that.
Appreciate it, because I cannot even see my time clock when I'm in this mode. So this is showing a couple different Porewater approaches. We're looking at a Trident probe, which puts down a number of probes down into the sediment surface. And then these are passive samplers, which we used in the 2020 investigation. We'll look at doing some additional work with these passive samplers, which go in the sediment. They sit for a period of about 30 days. These are these seepage meters that I talked about. These are these transducers that monitor the water level. And then, this is one example version of a piezometer or hydraulic potentiometer that measures the difference. You put it at 2 different elevations within the sediment and understand whether there's an upward force of groundwater flow through the sediment or whether there's a downward force. And so, you know, the visual assessments like I talked about, we need to GPS a variety of things, including, you know, remnant piles, top of the riverbank, figure out exactly where that is, large debris, large trees in the riverbank, and other features that are worth noting when we go through. And the underwater, kind of talk through that, sunken vessels, McCormick and Baxter cap extents. We want to do a couple verifications of, you know, what has been provided to us as this is the extent of the cap, and make sure that's truly accurate, as well as this timber pile wall. This really probably don't need to get into this too deeply, but this kind of shows we use this in our basis design report, some of the significant features that maybe that will be part of what we're going to survey. And then kind of the last piece is this biological assessment. So as part of this diver surveys, we're going to evaluate these sunken structures, mainly the barge, most likely. And is it being used as habitat? This has been down there since the late 70s, early 80s. Has this now become an artificial reef that's become habitat for species there, or is it just sitting there and it's not really habitat in any way, shape, or form? Bat and bird surveys, peregrine falcon nesting surveys, and bat roosting surveys for like under the bridge, and you know the effects of you know that related to our job site and what impacts we have to consider with that. Plant surveys. You know, there's been some limited plant surveys down on the top of the bank. We need to kind of complete that. So we'll do a tree inventory, rare plant and vegetation characterization, and then noxious weed surveys. All these things are factors we have to think about as we move forward into design. Wetland delineation. I don't think we're going to probably find any, but we need to formally do this wetland delineation and verify whether or not there is any defined wetland habitat within our project area. And then upland habitat, we want to understand, you know, what type of receptors may be transitioning using that riverbank transition zone. And then, you know, do a check of threatened, endangered, and sensitive species. We largely know through the Portland Harbor Superintendent site overall process, but we have to still kind of do this desktop analysis check that all species have been considered. So questions about the sampling goals and process, or any other factors I haven't talked about that we need to consider in the in-water design? All right. What is the timeline? So like I said, we kind of zoom into this slide. This is where we're at. We're in this draft development of the work plan. We have to do the final once we get comments back. And then we have a series of work. We'll do high river work. So when the river stage is high, as the river stage transitions, and then as the river stage drops, you know, all these different phases in the river, there's different investigations that have to occur. And then we have to write a report on the back end. And that report will probably be submitted in draft form sometime late winter, spring of 2023.
Hey, Josh, Cassie asked a question about climate impacts, worsening climate impacts, and how those are integrated in, how those factors are integrated.
Yeah, great question. So they are integrated. We have to consider climate impacts in our design. They're not really something that we need to do field investigations for. This presentation is focused on the investigations we're going to do in the field, but you're absolutely right. As part of our design process, we will integrate climate impacts and evaluate, you know, future trends with river stages, with dam release patterns, with storm cycle patterns. So all these things will be thought about, but they're really design processes versus data we have to collect in the field. And again, this is just a summary slide that goes back to the very beginning slide we had, where it's, you know, why are we sampling, what are we sampling, and how are we sampling? And that's kind of the end of my presentation.